and welcome to this week's episode of Star Wars Catalyst, a Rogue One novel, our book club episode. If you're not familiar with this series, basically what we do is we take a Star Wars book, a couple of chapters at a time, break down the themes and happenings, and right now we are finishing up part 1 of Catalyst. So today we are discussing chapters 12 and 13, which finish part 1, Life During Wartime, and I'm really excited to get into this with you guys. Chapter 12 is called A Cog in Something Turning. I think that's an interesting title, instead of just saying a cog in the machine or something like that. It's just to call it something turning makes it a little bit more metaphorical. But here we kind of get to the end of everything that's going on. The beginning of chapter 12 is the Geonosian riot, and this is something that had been built up by several chapters, that the people of the Republic, the engineers, they were having a lot of issues with the Geonosians and their behavior. And now we kind of get to what's going on with that. They were behaving for a while. They weren't having incidents for a little while. The dish of the Death Star was almost done. I still think it's funny how close they were to finishing the super weapon. Of course, it's still just called, like, the weapon. They haven't really called it the Death Star yet. About how close they were to finishing the Death Star, but without any real knowledge of what the Death Star even did. Like, it was so important for them to build this weapon, and it still has no weapon. But even as they have no weapon, it starts to get broken apart and broken down because of what the Geonosians are doing. And we all learn now that it's because of Poggle. Krennic gets on the phone and calls Poggle, and Poggle's on the run. And this was always his plan. His plan was to work with the Republic, basically, to kind of get out of prison so that he could go and join Dooku once again. He probably doesn't really care about the people of Geonosis all that much anyway, if he's willing to let all of his drones die like this. This was all his scheme to get back with the Separatists, and of course we know that's where he is, because in Revenge of the Sith, he's with the Separatists that Anakin/Vader kills on Mustafar. Even more so, Poggle was able to get a hyperdrive put on his shuttle, done in secret. Like, that was kind of the level of disinterest, really, that the Geonosian drones had, that he could just kind of send them to do whatever and no one really questioned it. And that's ultimately why he was able to get away. We get to Galen and his boss, and they're arguing. The boss doesn't really want to help the population, the overall population of the city, stay safe. They're still under bombardment. They've been under bombardment for quite some time. And he says that, you know, the people of this city could have done something about it, but their corrupt government isn't letting them do anything about it. He's just really interested in staying in his lane and doing what it is that he needs to get done to run his company. You know, he's not really out to save anybody, not necessarily out to hurt anybody either, but he wants to stay in his lane. The shield is ultimately destroyed, and the Ursos go on the run. And this is one of the most, this is probably one of the better action segments. Maybe action might not be the right word, but just kind of like tense on the run sections of a Star Wars book I've read. This part I actually remembered very clearly from the first time I read it before Rogue One. And I love this idea of the Ursos climbing this pile of rubble, trying to get away from the droids, and the droids coming up to them, and then at the last second the droids shut down and the Clone Wars are over. And it paints this really intense picture where, you know, we're kind of used to seeing the Clone Wars ending from the perspective of Revenge of the Sith. We've seen it now in Clone Wars in the final season that got released on Disney+. But it's always, so often, maybe not always, but it's so often from this perspective, what's going on in the battlefields where these critical moments are taking place. So obviously at this point, this is when, you know, Mace has probably just died. Palpatine has taken over and he's shutting down the droids. And so just to kind of give you an idea of what's going on in the films, is that's about as best as I can track for what's going on right now. And it's interesting to think about how on all of these different planets, the war just stopped. You know, the powers that be, especially Palpatine, would know that everything's kind of moving up into this point. And you can see the big pieces. But here on this planet, I mean, the Separatists just took over this planet. They have been trying to take over this planet for so long. And then the war just stops. And of course the war just stops because Palpatine's really in charge of both sides, and he knows he's about to off the rest of the Separatist leaders. He is like, we'll just end the war. And that's something it was just a very eerie thing for me to read the first time I read through the book. I also, to kind of revisit the chapter title, Cog and Something Turning, you know, this idea of these machinations going on. You know, you can see Poggle's plan to escape. You can see really that the Urso family and this planet in general is just a cog in some sort of machine, just one tiny bit, and not the big machine machinations itself, like I was just saying. So I thought, again, it was a really good chapter title. Chapter 13, Kyber Crystal Persuasion. We hear about the end of Rots, the end of Revenge of the Sith, where Vader and the Emperor and Tarkin are all on the ship, and they're going to go look at the Death Star, and that's what we see is the final scene of that film. Krennic isn't there because he's still kind of on the outs because of the whole Poggle business. But he's talking about how things basically changed overnight, that they still don't have a weapon, and they didn't really end up needing it because the Clone Wars didn't go to super weapon blows. But Krennic still needs Galen, because Galen is how he is going to rise in the ranks and rise to a position of power that he wants to be in this new empire. And to do that, he still has to get Galen. I also think it's fun that Krennic is wondering how dangerous Vader really is. Of course, Tarkin knows that Vader is Anakin. That gets spelled out in other sources, and it's just because Tarkin had spent so much time with Anakin that he was able to kind of pick up on that. Krennic probably never met Anakin. He probably knew the name. If he did meet Anakin, it would have been very brief. So this Vader guy would come on the scene, and he's just like, who's this dude in a suit? You know, he's like, is he any more dangerous than Masameda? You know, a bureaucrat and a politician. And I think that connects really well to the scene in Rogue One where Krennic goes to Vader's castle, which I don't know that Krennic really understands how wild it is that he is like a mere mortal inside of Vader's castle, and how few people really get to walk out of there and live. But I think of that smile when Vader does his dad joke, and he's like, be careful not to choke on your aspirations. As Vader walks away, Krennic smiles, and I always kind of interpreted that scene as Krennic didn't really take it as he was being put in his place there. He took it as he got to know something that no one else does, which is he got to know that Vader has these Jedi powers. And most people who learn that Vader has these powers don't live to tell anyone about it. So yeah, like, Krennic kind of got smacked around and put in his place a little bit by Vader, but he's thinking, I got to see who Vader really is, and I got to live, and I still get to be involved with this Death Star project. And I think that scene is really drawn upon here, or rather this part in the book connects to that part, I should say, just as a connection of like Krennic even starting to like think about who Vader is. And, you know, we see Krennic as the guy who always wants to know what's going on with other people and what are their thoughts, so he can kind of get to the root of it. Now that we are no longer in wartime, Krennic is able to offer Galen a job, and this job is not related to the military, it's not related to the war, and it's basically Galen's dream job. He's going to be head of research at a crystal studying place for making renewable energy to help rebuild worlds, and he's going to get Kyber crystals. So it's everything on like Galen's list of jobs I'd like to have is here. Like Krennic is gift wrapping for him everything he could want, but there's also these other things that are worrisome. The lab is being built on this refuge that was for some sort of protected population that has now been moved. The Kyber crystals he's gotten are probably from Jedi lightsabers, and the Jedi have mysteriously disappeared. You know, there's these red flags about what he's been given, but he's being given what he always wanted. And there's that kind of tension too, where like Lyra knows. Lyra is aware that there's something off, but she also can't deny that they need something to do. And they're constantly in this issue of being stuck with wanting to trust Krennic because he saved them, but also just everything feeling shady. That ends part 1, Life During Wartime, and to just kind of look over the part as a whole, I think it really gets into the themes of what is it like when you're not a frontlines person during the Clone Wars. We've spent a lot of time looking at the Clone Wars with the whole series, The Clone Wars, and there's several novels that take place in the Clone Wars, both in current canon and Legends, and some comics and all of that. And you get the sense of the battlefield, and I'm glad that we have that. That's some of my favorite story material. But this book was good to see what is it like when you're not a soldier? What is it like when you're trying hard not to be one? It kind of reminds me, too, of just what it's like being on Coruscant as everyone's playing their game. And this just kind of shows you what life is, how life changes, how the galaxy went from being so open to being something that's more closed off, how you went from being able to trust people to not being able to trust people, how people went from helping one another to not helping one another and kind of wanting to stay where they are and not ruffle too many feathers, not stick their head up too far. You know, everyone just kind of wants to lay low and get through this period of the Clone Wars. And how drastically life changed over those 3 years, and then you get to the end, and you get to where we hit Revenge of the Sith, and then you go from everything changing drastically over 3 years to everything changing drastically really in a matter of days, as the galaxy goes from the Republic to the Empire. And that's something that we'll get into in part 2. Part 2 being called The Pursuit of Peace. Which is, of course, a very Imperial type slogan. But that's really what I have to say this week. I know it's a little bit shorter, there wasn't as much to talk about, but I wanted to end on that chapter, or end on the end of part 1. But we're going to go ahead and discuss chapters 13, we already did 13. We're going to go ahead and discuss chapters 14 and 15 next week. It's going to be a bit of a chunk because chapter 15 is kind of long. So we'll make up with being shorter today with being longer next week, probably. But read chapters 14 and 15 for next week, and we will continue along in our journey. I would love to know what your thoughts are on the book so far, especially what your thoughts are of now that we've finished this part 1 and what how you're feeling about what we've seen. If you're not already, please follow us on the socials, and I'll talk to you guys next week.